Good evening and welcome to Mining the Riches of the Parsha. It is wonderful to be with you in person and to be with you on Zoom, and I thank every single one of you for joining. What a great pleasure. I've been looking forward to this all week, and here we are. Last Thursday night, we discussed the mitzvah of Sfiras HaOmer, of counting the Omer. Today, it's still before sunset. So last night we counted 35 days of the Omer, and that means that Shavuos is 2 weeks from tonight. That mitzvah occurred in last week's Torah portion. In this week's Torah portion, we have a similar mitzvah of counting, but this time, in this week's Torah portion, it's the double Parsha of BeHar b'chukosai. In BeHar, we have the mitzvah to count years. And this is a mitzvah that every 7 years is a Shemitah year in Israel, a sabbatical year. And after 7 cycles of 7, that's 49 years. The 50th year is the Yovel year, the Jubilee Year. And the Torah describes in our Torah portion what happens on the Shemitah year, what happens on the Yovel year. The Shemitah is relevant to us today. We do observe Shemitah. The past Jewish year, 5782, was a Shemitah year in Israel, but we do not observe Yovel today. I'm going to talk a little bit about that a little bit later on. So we count. Every year there is a count. Today is the first year. Today is the 30th year. Today is the 49th year, and then the next year will be Yovel. On the Yovel, the Jubilee year, the Torah says that on Yom Kippur, which is 10 days after the beginning of the Jewish New Year, the Shofar is blown. And we're going to discuss that also in just a few minutes. But Rabbi Jonathan Sachs points out a very subtle but very important difference between the two countings that is reflected in the text of the Torah itself. In last week's Torah Parsha, the Torah said, Usafartem lochem, you should count for yourselves the days of the Omer from the second day of Pesach until Shavuos. Shavuos is the 50th day after starting the counting. In this week's Torah portion, the Torah says, V'safarta lecha, and you should count for yourself. Last week's Torah portion, the mitzvah was in the plural. You plural should count. And in this week's Torah portion, the mitzvah is you singular. There's only one counting that takes place. Why the difference? They're both counting from 1 to 49. The difference is as follows. The mitzvah of counting the Omer is a mitzvah for every single one of us. Every single one of us has the mitzvah to count. Last night was the 35th day of the Omer. So it is addressed in last week's Torah portion in the plural because every single one of us is commanded. The mitzvah to count the years in this week's Torah portion is not a mitzvah for every individual. It's a mitzvah for only one counting. The counting was done by the Sanhedrin Hagadol, the great court, the great Sanhedrin that met in Jerusalem during the time that the Beis Hamikdash, the temple, was standing in Yerushalayim. It was the responsibility of that great supreme court to count. So it was one entity, one counting that took place. So v'safarta lecha, you singular should count because there was only one entity. By the way, the fact that we do not have a Sanhedrin Hagadol, we do not have a great Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, is one of the reasons that we do not have the institution of Yovel, the Jubilee Year. That's one of the two reasons that it's not relevant to us today. But when it was in place, that mitzvah devolved on the single entity of the Sanhedrin Hagadol, the Great Court. And Rabbi Sachs says that distinction is a very, very important distinction. Because individuals count days. I need to figure out, what am I doing today? And when I finish today, I have to figure out, what am I doing tomorrow? I go day by day. And I need to go day by day because I've had a busy day today. And tomorrow I also have a busy day. So I've got to keep track. What do I need to do today? What do I need to do tomorrow? Leaders must also count years. Leaders can not only be focused on what is immediately in front of us, but leaders must have a sense of vision. What's going to be in the future? What do I have to prepare for now that is not yet on the horizon? That is an essential aspect of leadership. Our rabbis in Pirkei Avos teach us, Ben Zoma teaches us, Ezehu Chacham, who is a wise person? Haroeh es hanolad, one who sees what is not yet born, one who thinks about and plans for what is beyond the visible horizon. That is an essential feature of leadership. You know, Chou Enlai was a great Chinese leader in the 1970s. He was once asked, what do you think about the French Revolution? It occurred in 1789. What do you think about the French Revolution? And Chou Enlai said, it's too soon to say. I remember very many years ago, I was just starting out. Very early in my career, I knew nothing. I had a friend. He was an executive director of the federation where we lived at that time. And this fellow was a very process-oriented person. He was very much into management systems. He used a lot of buzzwords. I learned a lot from him. He once asked me, tell me, what is your 5-year plan? I had no idea. I didn't know what a 5-year plan was. I'd never heard anybody discuss a 5-year plan, much less have an answer to what a 5-year plan is. But it was a formative conversation for me. And it influenced the way I have thought about my work since that time. We've discussed before the institution every Shabbos morning of the Haftorah. In addition to reading the weekly Torah portion, we also select one passage from the prophets to read, and we discuss the historical basis for it, and we also discuss the theme, the criteria by which the passage is chosen for each weekly Torah portion, and we discussed, based on the insights of the Rav, Rabbi Yosef Soloveitchik, that it is meant to inspire us, it is meant to comfort us. This week, the Torah portion is the double Parsha, BeHar and Bechukosai. Some years it's separate, just BeHar, just Bechukosai. Some years it's together. This year it's together. This year it's together, so the Haftorah for this Shabbos is the Haftorah for the second of the two, the Haftorah for Bechukosai. Fine, very nice. But on years when the two portions are separate, there's a separate Haftorah for BeHar and another Haftorah for Bechukosai, because it's two separate Shabboses. The Haftorah for BeHar, which we're not going to read this year, is incredible. It's from the prophet Yirmiyahu, Yirmiyahu Hanavi, Jeremiah the prophet. And it's a narrative. And the narrative goes like this. God says to Yirmiyahu, buy a field. This is the location of the field that you should buy. This is the owner from whom you should buy it. This is how much you should pay for the field. Write a sales contract. Take witnesses, count the money carefully, and take the sale contract and put it and keep it in a safe place. That's the Haftorah. So I ask you, is that inspiring? Well, maybe if you're a notary. But otherwise, it sounds a little boring. What's the message? What's the inspiration of this Haftorah? The message comes from the date. God commanded Yirmiyahu to buy the field in Israel just after God told him that the first Beis HaMikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, was going to be destroyed and the Jewish people were going to be exiled from Israel. Okay. So now it's not boring. It just sounds crazy. Why buy a field if Jerusalem is about to be destroyed and the Jewish people are about to be exiled and people from other nations are going to be living there? Why would you want to buy a field? And this question sets up the most powerful, inspiring lesson that the prophet Yirmiyahu has to teach us. It is, in fact, the antidote to the dire predictions in the second part of this week's Torah portion, the Parsha B'chukosai, where God says, yes, if you do what I say, everything's going to be okay. And if you do not do what I say, if you do not follow my commandments, then there's a very, very long list of catastrophic happenings and events that will occur, which in fact we know have all occurred to us, not only once, more than once. The antidote to that is the message within the date of the Haftorah of BeHar, just before Yerushalayim is going to be destroyed. The prophet continues, Kol Amar Hashem Tzvakos Elokei Yisrael. Thus says God, the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel. Od yiknu batim v'sados ukromim be'eretz hazos. There will again be a time when Jews will buy field and houses and fields and vineyards in this land, the land of Israel. God says there will be destruction. There will be desolation. There will be exile. There will be despair, just as the Parsha B'chukosai warns us. It is going to happen, God says. But God says, I am telling you now. Before it happens, don't despair. Jews will return to Israel. In fact, this moment, now, when God is speaking to Yirmiyahu, this moment of impending destruction is the best time to buy a piece of land in Israel. That's what it means. Don't just count days. Don't just think about what's going to happen tomorrow or the next day or this week. Count years. Plan for the long term. Look for what is beyond the horizon and start to plan for that. The truth is, of course, many Jews did give up hope of returning. And over the course of the past 2,000 years of this long exile, many Jews gave up hope of ever returning to Israel. But God never gave up on us. Od yiknu batim v'sados ukromim be'eretz hazos. There will come a time when Jews again will buy houses and fields and vineyards in the land of Israel. Today, property in Israel is worth more than perhaps any time in all of history. God is keeping his promise to us. I want to tell you this story. The first time I heard this story, I immediately thought of this Haftorah that I just shared with you, and this lesson from Rabbi Sachs about counting years in addition to days. Rabbi Shlomo Kahaneman was known to us as the Panovich Rav. Panovich was a small town in Poland before the war. There was a great yeshiva there. Of course, did not survive the war, but Rav Kahaneman, the Panovich Rav, the rabbi from Panovich, survived and made Aliyah, came to Israel. And shortly after he arrived, he bought land for a new yeshiva. It's in a place that is now called Bnei Brak, a suburb of Tel Aviv. And when he bought this land, it was very cheap. He got a good deal because 10 days after the sale, the British were withdrawing, and everyone knew the Arabs, they had announced the Arabs would invade 10 years hence. The seller said to him, "What are you going to do with this land?" And Rabbi Kahaneman said, "I'm going to rebuild the yeshiva of Panovich." At this time, he was 61 years old. He had lost his entire family in the Holocaust, except for one son who survived with him. He once said that every single night since 1939, he cried before going to sleep. So the seller says to him, "Yes, of course, you're getting a very good deal. But they're going to invade in 10 days. And Rav Kahaneman said, "The yeshiva for 10 days is also a yeshiva." And that attitude is necessary in order to build the yeshiva to last 100 years. That yeshiva, of course, the Panovich Yeshiva, is one of the largest centers of Jewish learning in the world today. Because the vision of Rabbi Kahaneman, not for what was happening in 10 days, but what would happen decades and centuries later. There is a mitzvah for every single one of us to count days. Usafartem lochem, the days of the Omer. We have to count days. We have to be aware, what do I need today? What do I need tomorrow? What's going to be in 10 days? But we also need to count years and decades and centuries and millennia. Safarta loch, like the Sanhedrin, with vision. Ezehu chacham, who is a wise person, who can see what is not even yet on the horizon. So I alluded to this at the beginning, but it's a curious fact that nowhere in the entire Torah does the Torah say, blow the shofar on Rosh HaShana. There is no verse like that anywhere. The only day where the Torah says blow the shofar is on Yom Kippur. But not every Yom Kippur, once in 50 years. In this week's Torah portion. Usafarta lecha sheva shabbosos shanim. You should count for yourself 7 years, 7 times, and that's going to add up to counting to 49. And then, when the 50th year comes, v'havarta shofar trua b'chodesh hashvi, be'asar lachodesh b'yom ha'kippurim, taviru shofar b'chol artzachem. On Yom Kippur of the 50th year, you should blow the shofar. There's a mitzvah to blow the shofar once every 50 years on Yom Kippur. And with that, v'kidashtem eshnas ha'chamishim shana, you will thereby sanctify the 50th year. Ukrasem dror ba'aretz l'chol yoshveh. You will proclaim liberty throughout the land for all of its inhabitants. Yovel hi tiyeh lochem. It should be for you a Jubilee year. So if there's no verse, why do we blow shofar on Rosh HaShana? It's a good question. Let's leave that for another time. But why do we blow shofar on Yom Kippur? So, first of all, we today blow shofar every year, Yom Kippur, at the end of Ne'ilah. But that is not what this mitzvah in our Parsha is about. The mitzvah of our Parsha is only when there is Yovel, and that requires two things, as I mentioned to you before. It requires the Beis HaMikdash in Jerusalem being functioning, which includes the Sanhedrin Agadol, the great Sanhedrin, sitting in court adjacent to the Beis HaMikdash, and it requires the majority of world Jewry to be living in Israel at that time. That is when there is a mitzvah on Yom Kippur of the 50th year to blow the shofar, By the way, that blowing of the shofar is during the day of Yom Kippur, and that would happen even if it was on Shabbos, not like Rosh HaShana, right? Rosh HaShana, if a day of Rosh HaShana falls on Shabbos, we don't blow the shofar that day. We've discussed that in the past. But this mitzvah would apply even if it was Shabbos, Yom Kippur. Our blowing the shofar today is not that mitzvah. Our blowing the shofar on Yom Kippur at the end of Ne'ilah is a minhag. It's a custom. It's not a law. It's not a mitzvah. It's a zecher. It's a remembrance of what used to happen and what will happen in the future on the Yovel year. And it happens, technically speaking, after Yom Kippur is over. At the end of Ne'ilah, Yom Kippur is over. Because Yom Kippur, just like Shabbos, we're not allowed to blow musical instruments. A shofar is muksa on Yom Kippur. We're not allowed to blow it on Yom Kippur itself. So if we're going to have a minhag, a custom about blowing a shofar, it's got to be after Yom Kippur is technically over. That's why we blow it at the end of Ne'ilah. But when it was a mitzvah, what our Parsha is describing, why blow a shofar on Yom Kippur? What does a shofar have to do with Yom Kippur? So, to explain this, I need to share a short introduction. There is a subject also discussed in this week's Torah portion, the beginning of BeHar. There's a subject called Eved Ivri, which means a Jewish person who is an indentured servant. So what that means is as follows. You have a person finds themselves in debt. They do not have the assets to pay off the debt. So they are required, they could be ordered by the court, that they have to go into the employ of someone to work off the debt. And in fact, it is a very progressive system, much better than the system we have today of bankruptcy, and certainly much better than what existed up to 100 years ago of debtor's prison. Those are horrible, horrible things. Here you have a progressive system where a person who owes money, they don't have the money, they get to work it off. And there's a maximum term. No matter how much you owe, there's a maximum. And the maximum is either 6 years and you go free in the 7th year, or Yovel, until the next Jubilee Year. Whichever comes first, then that ends the period and you get a second chance. You get a fresh start, and this interrupts the cycle of poverty. It's a magnificent social system. It's not a bailout. It's not a handout. It allows a person to work off the debt, but to be able to have a second chance, not to be overwhelmed by the debt. When our Torah portion says, "Ukrasem dror ba'aretz l'chol yoshveh," and you shall, in the Jubilee year, the Yovel year, you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land, this is what it's referring to, the liberty of every person who is an Eved Ivri. Now's the time they get to go free. That's the liberty we're talking about. The shofar announces the beginning of the liberty. One more time. Vavarta shofar trua b'chodesh hashvi, and you will blow the shofar on Yom Kippur, ukrasem dror ba'aretz l'chol yoshvel, and you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land of letting every Eved Ivri go home, go free. So the shofar was an announcement. An announcement, the time has come, you get to go free. Okay. So that's why there's a mitzvah to blow shofar on Yovel, on Yom Kippur. Let me ask you a question. Why is it Yom Kippur? Why not on Rosh HaShana? The Jewish New Year begins on Rosh HaShana, the beginning of the year, the first day of the new year. That's the day that the Yovel begins. Why do we only blow shofar 10 days later on Yom Kippur? So the answer to that is a pasuk later in the Torah, in the Parsha of Rabbi, in Dvarim. The Torah says as follows: when it comes time, if you employ an Eved Ivri, and it comes time to let this Eved Ivri go free, to finish their employment, lo sishalchenu rekam. Don't let that person leave your employment empty-handed. Ha'anek taniklo. Give them gifts, presents. Give them presents. That's what happened between Rosh HaShana and Yom Kippur of the Yovel year. Between Rosh HaShana and Yom Kippur of the Yovel year, there would be a time for giving gifts and for feasting and for celebrating the coming freedom. So there's this 10-day period, fascinating. Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur is this time of celebration and feasting and giving gifts to everyone who is going to go free on Yom Kippur. All right, well, that's interesting. So, the actual liberty started on Yom Kippur. That's why the shofar is on Yom Kippur. The shofar announces you're going free. The first 10 days, theoretically, it's already the Yovel year, but we're celebrating and we're giving gifts. So the shofar is on Yom Kippur. This is when you go free, you go home. It's a signal of starting fresh. It's a signal of a new chance in life. The past is settled. Time to move forward, which also is the theme of Yom Kippur, of atonement, of forgiveness. Move forward, leave the past behind. We're moving forward. Fresh start. Okay, well, that's interesting. But why do it like that? I mean, yes, it's nice to give gifts, but why not just let them go home on Rosh Hashanah? Blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. Why not have the release on Rosh Hashanah? So the Torah says something fascinating. Also in the book of Dvarim, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I wanted to read back in where I was, in the Parsha of Rabbi, in Dvarim. Okay, one more time, what I read before. When you let this Eved Ivri go free, don't let them go empty-handed. Haneg taniklo, give gifts to them. This is what happened between the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And the next verse, V'zacharta, and remember, Ki Eved hayisa be'eretz Mitzrayim, you were servants in Egypt. V'yiftecha Hashem elakecha, and God redeemed you from Egypt. Al kain anochi mitzavcha es hadavar hazeh hayom. Therefore, I am commanding you in this mitzvah today. That's strange. What's the connection between giving gifts and leaving Egypt? Rabbi Jonathan Sachs explained something just absolutely magnificent. Before the Jews left Egypt, God told Moshe to tell the Jews to go to their Egyptian neighbors and to ask for gold and silver and garments. And the Egyptians gave this gold and silver and garments to the Jewish people just before they left. Why? There's a mitzvah in the Torah, in the book of Dvarim, in the Parsha Kisetse. The Torah says, Lo sisa'ev mitzri. A Jewish person is not allowed to hate an Egyptian. Not allowed to bear a grudge against an Egyptian because of what the Egyptians did to us when we were slaves in Egypt. We're not allowed to bear a grudge. Why? Says Rabbi Sachs, because a people driven by hate cannot be free. This means drawing a line over the resentments of the past, writes Rabbi Sachs. That is why when a slave went free, a servant went free, an Eved Ivri, his master had to give him gifts. This is the connection between the two. This is not to compensate for the fact of the servitude. There's no way of giving back the years spent in servitude, but there is a way of ensuring that the parting is done with goodwill, with some symbolic compensation. The gifts allow the former servant to reach emotional closure, to feel that a new chapter is beginning, to leave without anger and a sense of humiliation. One who has received gifts finds it hard to hate. And that's the significance of the gold and silver that the Egyptians gave the Jews before leaving. The Torah says, V'nitzaltem, and you shall, sometimes it's translated as, and you shall plunder the Egyptians by taking their gold and silver. But Beno Jacob, a commentator in the early 20th century, understands it, V'nitzaltem, you shall save, redeem. The gifts they took from their neighbors were intended to persuade the Jewish people that it was not the Egyptians as a whole, only Paro and the leadership who were responsible. The gifts were meant to save the Jews from living with hate, to save any possible future revenge by Israel against the Egyptians. That's the verse that we just read. V'yiftecha Hashem Elokecha. God redeemed you in Egypt, redeemed you from hatred. Al Kain, Anochi mitzavcha es hadavar hazeh hayom. Therefore, I'm commanding this mitzvah: when a servant goes free, give gifts, so that the person who is leaving will not leave with a sense of hate and animosity, but will be able to leave free. That's the mitzvah of Shofar on Yom Kippur. To announce that this freedom and the gift of leaving behind anger and hatred is happening now. We don't have this mitzvah today. We hope it will return soon. We have a reminder of it at the end of Ne'ilah every year, and we remember it when we study this week's Torah portion. Because the truth is, every single one of us has a need for a fresh start, to be able to leave behind animosity, to leave behind hate. The purification of forgiveness that we offer to each other, forgiveness that we offer to God, and forgiveness that we offer to ourselves on Yom Kippur. And now, there is scientific proof that this works. Last week in the New York Times, Catherine Pearson wrote an article about a study that was presented recently at Harvard University that studied the subject of forgiveness, comparing people who worked on trying to forgive others versus people that did not have that specific experience. And this study found, it was a large study of thousands of people, found that those who worked on forgiving others showed markedly reduced symptoms of anxiety and depression, lower stress, improved sleep. Tyler Vanderweel is one of the co-authors of this study, and he said, what forgiveness does is free the victim from the offender. I would never say, once you're forgiven, everything's fine, but it is a better alternative to rumination or suppression, and that is why it can improve overall mental well-being. What does it mean to forgive someone? My working definition is just to replace ill will toward the offender with goodwill. Forgiveness is not forgetting the action or pretending it didn't happen. It's not excusing or condoning the action, and it's not the same as reconciling or foregoing justice. One can forgive while still pursuing a just outcome. So if you want to try it, here's an exercise. One exercise is to set up two chairs facing each other and pretend the one who offended you or hurt you is in one of the chairs and you sit in the other chair. And you speak to the offender in the chair in front of you, the empty space, but in the chair that you imagine is this person. And you describe what happened to you from your perspective, how it made you feel, the impact it had on your life, what that person did to you. And then you move to the other chair and you tell the story and describe what happened from the point of view of the offender. It can be very unsettling, but it's a very powerful experience. And that is the message that we are to learn from blowing the shofar on Yom Kippur in our Torah portion. Before Nelson Mandela left prison, he said, "As I stand before the door to my freedom, I realize that if I do not leave my pain, anger, and bitterness behind me, I will still be in prison." Forgiving does not make you weak. It sets you free. Let me share one last piece with you. So the second part of this week's Torah portion, the Parsha B'chukosai, it's a very heavy Parsha. In B'chukosai telechu, God says, if you follow my commandments, v'nasati gishmechem bitam, I will give you rain in the proper time, you'll have plenty, you'll have peace, you'll have security, all the wonderful material, physical things that are going to go well for you. And if you do not follow my commandments, then that's a longer list of all the things that will happen to us. It's interesting, and many of the commentators ask this question, what you don't see in either list, the good things that happen or the bad things that happen, you don't see any of the spiritual blessings that we always talk about. What about Olam Haba? What about the world to come? That's the real reward. We understand that we're not getting our reward for the good things we do here in this world. Here in this world, we're supposed to act, but we don't see the results. We don't see the righteous being rewarded and the evil and the evil people being punished. We don't see it. Because it will happen in Olam Haba, in the world to come, God will judge us and we will be rewarded for all of our mitzvahs. Why isn't that mentioned in the Parsha? Why doesn't the Torah say, if you follow my commandments, you'll get Olam Haba, and if you do not follow my commandments, you'll get the opposite? Further, we learn, also in Pirkei Avos, our rabbis teach us, don't be the kind of person who serves their master for a reward. Rather, you should be the kind of person who serves their master without wanting to get a reward. In other words, it's rather childish to only do something good because you're going to be rewarded with something, a piece of candy. A child will do that. Once a person has a bit of maturity, we want a person to do the right thing because it's the right thing. Do the right thing because it's the right thing, not because of the reward that you're going to get. And this Torah portion seems to absolutely disagree with that. All the rewards you get if you do it right, all the punishments you get if you do it wrong, aren't we supposed to do it for its own sake? Dr. Abraham Twerski suggests the following understanding. We are looking at this week's Torah portion not in the right manner. The positive things that are promised and the negative things that are predicted, they are not rewards and punishments. Think of the Torah as an instruction manual. You buy a complicated machine, a car, a washing machine, and it comes with instructions. And the instructions say, here's how to take care of this machine. And if you take care of the machine properly, it's going to work well. And if you do not take care of the machine properly, it's going to break in this way, in this way, in this way. The Torah is an instruction manual. The Torah is telling us not rewards and punishment, but consequences. The Torah is saying if you use the world properly by following God's commandments, the consequences are that the machine of life will work out okay. And you'll have what you need. And if you do not use it properly, it's going to get broken. And this is what it looks like if it gets broken. The Torah says later, also in Dvarim, Moshe says to the Jewish people, Re'eh ani nosin levnecha hayom es hachayim ves hamavos, es habracha ves haklola. See, I have placed before you today life and death, blessing and curse. Ubacharta b'chayim. Choose life. It's not the reward. Use the instruction manual to use the machine properly. Choose to do it right. And you'll be able to have the benefit of the working machine, of a well-working life. That's the meaning of our Torah portion. It's not talking about reward and punishment. Reward and punishment, yes, is in the world to come. It's talking about the consequences of using the machine with the instruction manual. In the 1950s and 1960s in Bnei Brak, second time I mentioned Bnei Brak tonight, there was a very great scholar, another very great scholar, Rabbi Yechezkel Levenstein. A great scholar, a great teacher, a great leader. And he was once addressing a crowd, and he held up an electric food processor in front of the crowd, and he said, from here we know that the Torah that we have comes directly from God at Mount Sinai. This is the proof. And he explained. He said that his wife, they live in Bnei Brak, his wife received a food processor as a gift. In the 1960s in Bnei Brak, it was unusual to find anybody with a food processor. And she received a gift of a food processor. Amazing thing. It's wonderful. Rabbi Levenstein came home and he sees that his wife is crying. He says to her, why are you crying? And she says, well, I received this amazing gift, but I don't know how to use it. I don't know what to do with it. It has no meaning for me. I don't know how to use it. So Rabbi Levenstein and his wife went through the trash can to find the instructions. They found the instruction manual, and his wife started crying again. Now why are you crying? Because I can't read it. It's written in English. She didn't speak English. So I've got an instruction manual and I don't know what it means and I can't use it. So Rabbi Levinstein found a young man who spoke English, who could read the instruction manual and translate it to his wife. And when his wife heard the instructions and what you can do with this machine, she started dancing around the kitchen in joy. Amazing! I've got this amazing, amazing gift. Said Rabbi Levinstein, that is the joy of Shavuos, 2 weeks from tonight. That is the joy of the Jewish people receiving the Torah at Mount Sinai. The joy of the elimination of doubt. This is the instruction manual. We're in this world, we're in this life, it's complicated. Often we don't know what to do, how to proceed. Here's the instruction manual. What a great joy to have instruction and also to have teachers and rabbis who, if we can't read it and understand it ourselves, they can read it for us and they can explain it to us so that we'll know how to use it. That's what we celebrate on Shavuos, 2 weeks from tonight. We celebrate that we received this instruction manual. The joy of the holiday of Shavuos is our ability to learn how God wants us to use this world. That joy is the joy of the instruction manual, the Torah, instructions for life. My friends, I want to wish you a great evening. It's wonderful to be with you in person and on Zoom. I wish you a great Shabbos, and I look forward to seeing everyone soon in person.